They remember us as the golden couple of the jazz age, but they never heard me cry into hotel pillows while my husband turned our life into his novel. Before you envy my marriage to F. Scott Fitzgerald, let me tell you what it really cost me to be his muse, his lover, and his favorite tragedy. Montgomery was a city of rules, and I was born into the house that wrote half of them. My father, Judge Sayer, kept his court in order with a gavel and a stare that could freeze a room. My mother, Maddie, ruled the drawing room with lace gloves and a calendar thick with teas and charity galas. I was the youngest, the last bright hope for Southern gentility, and every day I felt those expectations pressing down like the Alabama heat. But I learned early that attention was its own kind of freedom. My name, Zelda Sayer, appeared in the society columns before I could spell it myself. They called me the wild girl of Perry Street, the judge's daughter who smoked behind the hydrangeas and danced barefoot on the marble steps of the country club. At Margaret Booth School, they tried to teach me French and manners, but I preferred the language of spectacle, a daring skirt, a cigarette held just so, laughter that rang too loud in the parlor. My report cards were a ledger of mischief, late to class, caught whispering, a note about the unladylike way I led the glee club chorus. Montgomery's debutante rituals were a stage, and I played my part with a wink. At the Spring Fling in 1918, I switched from a waltz to a Charleston in the middle of the floor, cigarette ash trailing behind me. The newspapers loved it, Miss Sayer, the city's firecracker, racing streetcars on her bicycle and diving into fountains when the night got too dull. I collected rumors like dance cards, knowing each one made me more visible, more untouchable, more myself. Every glance, every whisper, was proof that I could bend the rules and the world would still turn. I was never content to be just another Southern belle waiting for a husband in the drawing room. I wanted an audience, and I wanted the world to know my name. Even then, I was restless for something bigger than Montgomery, something wilder than the boundaries of Perry Street and the country club lawn. He was standing by the bandstand, a soldier's cap cocked over one eye, watching me as if I were the only person in the room. The air inside the Montgomery Country Club was thick with perfume and powder and the clatter of champagne glasses, but I felt his gaze like a current under my skin. I was 18, wild with the certainty that nothing could touch me, and here was this stranger from the north, F. Scott Fitzgerald, they whispered. A lieutenant with a Princeton pin, his uniform pressed sharp, his eyes hungry and uncertain all at once. That night, the ballroom lights made everything shimmer. I let myself be led into a waltz, but my heart was racing ahead to the next song, the next dare. When Scott finally crossed the floor, he didn't ask my name. He just said, "Will you dance?" As if the question had already been answered. His hand found mine, warm and trembling, and we spun through the crowd until the world narrowed to the sound of our laughter and the brush of his sleeve against my bare arm. He told me later he'd never seen anyone move like I did, barefoot by midnight, my shoes abandoned under a table, my dress damp from the garden fountain. But it was his attention, not his words, that lit me up. I wanted to be seen, truly seen, and for one electric night, I was. The war was waiting outside the doors, but inside, we were young and invincible, dancing as if the future belonged to us alone. I didn't know then how much it would cost to be someone's obsession, or how quickly admiration could turn into possession. I only knew that the first time Scott looked at me, I felt a thrill I'd spend years trying to recover or outrun. I never believed in surrender, not even to love. When Scott asked me to marry him, I said yes with a smile and a dare in my voice. But the world I came from, Montgomery parlors, debutante balls, a father who measured worth in reputation and bank ledgers, taught me to set my own terms. I wanted more than a ring and a promise. I wanted proof. I wanted a future that glittered, not just in Scott's stories, but in the hard currency of contracts and headlines. By June of 1919, the letters between us had turned sharp. I told him I would not marry a man who couldn't keep me in the style I'd been trained to expect. I wanted parties, travel, freedom from the smallness of Montgomery. I wanted to be his equal, not just his prize. The engagement was broken with a single letter, my signature neat, my resolve absolute. The newspapers called it a prudent decision, but it was more than that. It was a challenge. Show me you can turn words into money, dreams into something I can hold in my hand. Show me I won't lose myself in your hunger. That summer, our love became a negotiation, his ambition against my refusal to settle. I demanded proof, and he responded with chapters, promises, and the fevered hope of a book that would make us both famous. Each letter was a bargaining chip, each silence a test. I made him fight for me, not because I didn't love him, but because I needed to know I could shape my own fate. I would not walk blindly into another person's story. I would require evidence, not just affection. A contract, not just a vow. That was the only way I knew to survive. We married in New York on April 3rd, 1920, less than a week after F. Scott Fitzgerald's book hit the shelves and his name began to flicker in the city's electric glow. I wore a suit, not a gown, and we said our vows in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral, while the city outside thundered with taxis and headlines. There was no grand ballroom, no train of lace, only the hush of a borrowed parlor and the sharp scent of lilies from the altar. Even in that quiet, I could feel the world pressing in, hungry for a glimpse of the Southern girl who had crossed the Mason-Dixon line for love and spectacle. We stepped out onto Madison Avenue and straight into the jaws of the press. Reporters shouted my name, Zelda, as if I belonged to them already. That afternoon, the New York Tribune called me the first American flapper, as if I had invented rebellion with a bobbed haircut and a laugh too loud for polite company. My face was splashed across the city's pages. My new name, Mrs. F. Scott Fitzgerald, linked forever to a novel, a movement, a myth. I wasn't just a bride. I was a symbol, a headline, a promise that the old rules were crumbling and something wild was taking their place. Scott beamed at the attention, but I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders. Our private promises, quiet words exchanged in a borrowed room, were drowned out by the roar of a public eager for legends. The ink was barely dry on our marriage certificate when I realized we'd been cast as America's newest sensation. The girl from Montgomery and the boy with the golden pen, flung together by ambition and hunger, were devoured by the story that others wanted to write for us. From that day, every gesture, every quarrel, every party dress was public property. I became the flapper queen, but the crown was forged from expectation, and it pinched. Fame isn't a spotlight, it's a cage lined with mirrors, and I could already see myself disappearing into the reflection. The first months in New York tasted like cold champagne, sharp, sweet, and always a little too much. Scott and I became headliners on a stage we never left, swept from speakeasy to rooftop, from the plaza's marble bar to the smoky corners of the Montmartre Club, always arm in arm, always watched. The world called us the golden couple, and for a while, I almost believed in the magic of our reflection. Reporters trailed us down Fifth Avenue, noting the tilt of my hat, the newness of my shoes, the way Scott's laughter cut through the din. We were young, famous, and married less than a week, and already the city's gossip columns fed on every detail. What I ordered for lunch at the Biltmore, who poured the first glass of Veuve Clicquot at Tony Soma's after hours. I learned to dance until sunrise in rooms where the band never tired, and the air was thick with gin and the perfume of women who called themselves modern. We moved in a blur, one night at the Ziegfeld Follies, the next at a masked ball on Long Island, the next on a midnight train to Atlantic City. Scott scribbling story ideas on cocktail napkins while I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the city lights recede. The press called us wild, beautiful, reckless, the faces of a new era. They never saw the exhaustion behind my smile or the way my hands shook after the third party in a single night. Every invitation was a test. Could we outlast the crowd? Outshine the next couple? Outdrink the last round? I played the flapper queen, daring anyone to look away, but the applause always faded by morning. Sometimes I caught my own reflection in a gilded mirror, eyes rimmed with kohl, lips stained red, and wondered if I was still the girl from Montgomery or just a character in someone else's story. Scott wanted us to be legendary, and I wanted to be seen, so we kept going, harder, faster, louder, until the city itself pulsed in our veins. But the parties never really ended. They only blurred into each other, leaving me hollow and hungry for something real. The more the world adored us, the more I felt myself dissolving into the image they craved. I laughed, I danced, I drank, and still some quiet part of me began to ache for silence, for rest, for a room where I could close the door and remember who I was before the world decided I was theirs. Scotty was born on a gray March morning in 1921, in a hospital room with starched sheets and the city's clamor muffled beyond the window. I remember the hush after her first cry, the sudden, impossible fact of a daughter, tiny and pink and utterly dependent, pressed to my chest. My own mother sent flowers and advice by telegram, and Scott hovered, pale with pride and terror, as if he'd witnessed a miracle and a crime at the same time. I studied Scotty's face for proof. Whose chin? Whose eyes? Whose restless spirit? I found only a helpless, blinking question. Would she be his? Or mine? Or someone altogether new? Motherhood came at me sideways. I was 20, still breathless from the chase of New York and the echo of my own name in the papers. Now there was a crib in the corner of our hotel suite, bottles stacked beside Scott's manuscripts, and lullabies sung to the rhythm of typewriter keys. I wrote letters to friends in Montgomery, describing the baby's impossible appetite, the way she gripped my finger with a force that startled me. Yet even as I rocked her to sleep, I felt a nervous flutter, the fear that I might disappear into this new role, that the world would shrink to diapers and doctor's visits and the endless, invisible labor of keeping a small person alive. We traveled constantly, from New York to St. Paul, then back to the city, never settled, always in search of the next party or the next contract. Scott carried Scotty like a prop at literary lunches, beaming for the photographers, while I watched the world tilt around us. In public, I played the devoted mother, all bows and soft hands, but inside, I was restless, hungry for the stage, the canvas, the page. I scribbled stories between feedings, painted watercolors on the backs of old invitations, desperate to prove that I was still Zelda, not just Mrs. Fitzgerald or Scotty's mama. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by the window and watch the city burn with possibility, Scotty's breath warm against my shoulder. I loved her fiercely, but I was terrified that I would vanish into her needs, that my own voice would be smothered by bottles and bedtime stories. The world wanted me to be a symbol, a wife, a mother. But I wanted to be an artist too. I wanted something of my own, something that would outlast the headlines and the nursery, and even the love that first swept me into this life. Scotty was my anchor, but she was also a mirror, showing me everything I might lose if I let myself be defined by someone else's story. I used to think being loved by a writer would mean being seen, truly, entirely, as myself. But Scott loved me in fragments, and those fragments became his stories. I recognized myself in his sentences before I even saw the drafts. The wild girl from Montgomery, the restless wife, the dazzling flapper with a cigarette in her teeth. He borrowed my laughter, my letters, my private fears, and pressed them into the pages as if they belonged to him all along. It started quietly, almost flattering. He wrote about a girl who dove into fountains, who danced barefoot at midnight, who refused to be tamed. I read the proofs of this side of paradise and found lines I had whispered to him in bed, stories I had told only to make him laugh. Even the way I signed my name, Zelda with a flourish, turned up in his dialogue. I told myself it was a kind of devotion, that I was his muse, that our life together was worth immortalizing. But each time he asked for another anecdote, another memory, I felt myself shrinking, becoming less a person and more a collection of stories for him to rearrange. When The Beautiful and Damned arrived, I saw our quarrels and reconciliations, our parties and silences, dressed up in fiction. Once I found a page in his manuscript scrawled with my own words, lifted straight from a letter I had written during a sleepless night. He had underlined a phrase, my phrase, and scribbled in the margin, "Use this." Zelda's voice. As if my voice could be picked up and put down at his convenience, as if it belonged to him the moment he decided it was interesting enough to keep. I tried to laugh it off, to play the part of the clever wife who inspired genius, but the more I saw myself on his pages, the more I wondered if there would be anything left of me once he finished writing. Our life was mined for material, my secrets, my dreams, my disappointments, all repurposed for the next chapter, the next review. He called it collaboration. I called it theft. I wanted to be a creator, not just a character. I wanted my own canvas, my own blank page. But every time I tried to claim a story for myself, I felt the weight of his pen pressing me back into the margins. That is when the anger began to burn, not just at Scott, but at the world that applauded him for turning my life into his masterpiece, while I was left searching for a voice that sounded like my own. The Riviera sun shimmered across the water, gold pressed thin and endless, but I felt almost invisible beneath its glare. We moved from Paris to Antibes, Cannes to Monte Carlo, trailing after laughter and music that never quite filled the silence. The world called us the lost generation, but I wasn't lost. I was isolated, surrounded by artists and writers who drank to forget, who measured each other's success in glances and applause. Scott called it paradise, but I saw the cracks in the marble before anyone else dared to look. Our rented villas overflowed with the beautiful and the damned, Gerald and Sarah Murphy among them, their laughter echoing off the stone. Hemingway, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. Picasso, always with a new muse. We circled the same pools, told the same stories, clung to the same rituals. I learned the steps expected of an expatriate wife, mornings in shaded gardens, afternoons writing letters that skirted the truth, evenings at the casino or beach. My smile practiced and polite. Always in company, rarely in conversation. The parties sparkled, but the hours between them stretched thin and pale. The Riviera light bleaching even the brightest colors from my days. In letters home from 1924 to 1926, I described the blue of the Mediterranean, the taste of apricots and wine, the cool dusk air. I left out the ache, the sense of fading into someone else's story, my own voice growing quieter with every toast to Scott's brilliance. I began to haunt ballet studios, searching for discipline and beauty that belonged to me alone. At the bar, I tried to remember how it felt to move for myself, not for anyone's amusement. Those letters are full of longing, for home, for escape, for a self not shaped by applause. The Riviera was a dream, but I woke each morning lonelier, surrounded by brilliance, starved for meaning. Ballet became my secret rebellion, the place where my body belonged only to me. In Antibes, when the parties faded and the hangover set in, I slipped away to the studios, bare floors, high windows, the smell of resin and sweat. I found a teacher, Madame Igorova, who'd danced for Diaghilev, and she drilled me with the same ferocity she used on girls half my age. I wanted that. Discipline, pain, the clean ache of muscle after 8 hours at the bar. My feet blistered, my toenails turned black, but I clung to the routine like a lifeline. Each tendu, each pirouette felt like a protest against being ornamental, against being rewritten in Scott's prose. The studio became my refuge, my confessional. I filled diary pages with notes on arabesques and adagios, tracing the lines of my body in words no one else could edit. In April 1924, I wrote to Scott, "The arabesque is my salvation." I meant it. There was a performance coming, a real one, with a program and a ticket stub and my name in small print beside the other hopefuls. I practiced until my legs shook, until the world narrowed to the count of 8 and the slap of my slippers on the wood. But the discipline came at a cost. My body grew sharper, hungrier, more brittle. Meals became negotiations. Sleep was patchy and feverish. I woke with bruises and a pounding in my temples, but I pressed on, convinced that if I worked hard enough, if I danced well enough, I could carve out a space that was only mine. The instructors admired my will, but I saw in their eyes the worry reserved for late bloomers and lost causes. Still, I kept dancing. The studio lights were harsh and honest. There, I was not a muse or a wife or a character in someone else's story. I was a woman fighting for her own authorship, one strained, trembling movement at a time. The world outside could have its legends. In the mirror, I watched myself vanish and reappear, sweat slick and stubborn, refusing to be erased. The summer Edouard Jozan arrived, the Riviera seemed to hum with possibility and risk. He was a French aviator, tan, self-assured, and just unfamiliar enough to draw out something reckless in me. He checked into the Hotel du Cap Eden Rock on July 9th, 1924. The same week, Scott and I tried to settle into another uneasy truce. I felt worn thin by the endless parties, the expectation to be dazzling. Jozan's world was different. He invited me to see his plane in Nice, the metal wings catching the sun, and for a brief moment, I felt weightless, untethered from the roles I had been handed. I wrote to a friend about him, admitting he made me feel alive in a way I had not in years. Scott noticed the change. He watched from the terrace, suspicion sharpening his gaze. Our letters turned cold, edged with accusation. He said I was chasing illusions, risking everything for a thrill he could not control. I did not argue. I wanted to know if I could still be wanted for myself, not as a famous man's wife or a character in his stories. Jozan became a reflection of all the paths I might have taken. We spent afternoons along the coast, laughter echoing a little too loudly, glances lingering a little too long. Hemingway wrote in his diary that I was seen on a boat with the aviator, laughing louder than the rest. Even my sister Rosalind heard the rumors. She told me Scott threatened divorce unless I ended it. His pride cut raw. The confrontation came late in August, after too many drinks and too many words left unsaid. Scott's voice trembled with something deeper than jealousy. He demanded to know if I loved Josanne, if I would leave. I told him I did not want to run, but I needed to know I could. That summer, trust snapped. Josanne left, but the damage stayed. Every fight after was sharper, every apology more desperate. Love, once tested, never returns unscarred. We became a spectacle long before we ever meant to. But by the early 1930s, our misery was theater. The hotel lobbies and marble-floored restaurants of New York and Paris became our stage. We drank too much, fought too loudly, and invited the world to watch as we tore each other apart. I can still taste the bitterness of gin at the St. Regis, the sting of Scott's voice echoing off the columns as he accused me of ruining his genius. He'd slam his glass down, daring me to contradict him, and I would, always. Sometimes it ended with a broken vase, sometimes with a police escort into the night air. Our names scribbled in the morning papers beside words like disturbance and scene. Alcohol was our co-conspirator, blurring the line between love and cruelty. I remember the Algonquin, the way Hemingway leaned across the table, his voice just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She's a lunatic," he said, and the laughter that followed was sharp as broken glass. Scott never defended me, not really. He'd turn his anger inward, or let it spill out in a torrent, blaming my dancing, my laughter, my very existence for his failures. I gave as good as I got. I called him a coward, a leech, a small man hiding behind big words. We knew how to wound each other in public, to make the pain a performance. The press loved it. Hotel staff learned to look away. There were nights when I'd wake up in a stranger's suite, the taste of blood and champagne in my mouth, not sure whether it was my own or his. We were both addicted to the spectacle, unable to stop even as it hollowed us out. We weren't just destroying each other in private. We wanted witnesses. We wanted the world to see how far we could fall together. The first time I collapsed, it was not on a ballroom floor or under the lights of a Paris nightclub, but in a narrow hospital room in Baltimore, 1930. I remember the white of the walls more than the faces, how the nurses spoke to me as if I were a child, how the doctors wrote notes while I tried to explain the ache in my chest and the static in my head. They called it a breakdown, as if I were a machine that had simply run too long without oil. Scott signed the admission papers with a trembling hand. I watched him from the bed, his face pale and set, and wondered if he felt relief or defeat. The letters from the clinic still carry the scent of disinfectant and fear. One doctor wrote that Mrs. Fitzgerald is exhibiting symptoms of schizophrenia and that rest and seclusion are advised. I wanted to scream, what did they know of me? Of the years spent holding up the ceiling of our marriage, of the nights I pressed a pillow over my ears to block out the sound of my own thoughts? They measured me in symptoms, not in stories. Each question felt like a test I was meant to fail. Inside those walls, I was no longer Zelda, wild girl of Montgomery, or queen of the flappers. I was a patient, a case file, a problem to be solved by men in white coats. The world outside kept spinning, parties and novels and headlines, but I was trapped in a place where my voice did not matter. I lay awake at night, planning escape routes in my mind, promising myself that if I ever got out, I would write everything down. My words, not his. I would not let them lock me away in silence. I would not let them take my story. They handed me a stack of blank paper in the clinic, as if it might soak up the ache. The walls were white, the air heavy with the smell of carbolic and boiled cabbage, and I was supposed to rest, be quiet, be grateful, be cured. But my mind refused to lie still. I began to write, at first in secret, the words pouring out faster than the doctors could prescribe their little blue pills. I wrote of Alabama summers and Parisian nights, of a girl who danced until her feet bled, and a woman who tried to hold her marriage together with laughter and silk thread. I wrote as if my life depended on it, because it did. I called it Save Me the Waltz. Those pages were mine, every line a rebellion against the silence that had pressed on me for years. I sent the manuscript to Scribner's in September 1932, the ink barely dry, my hands shaking as I signed the contract. They offered me $2,500, real money, not Scott's, not a husband's allowance, but an advance for my own story. The letter from John McIntyre at Scribner's felt like a passport out of the clinic, stamped with my name alone. I wrote from a hospital bed, surrounded by nurses who spoke in whispers and doctors who measured my worth in symptoms. But on the page, I was the author. I was the architect of my own disaster and my own salvation. For once, I was not the flapper in someone else's novel, not the muse in the margins, but the writer. My voice, raw and unvarnished, was finally in print. I had placed my art on the table, dared the world to read me, not as Scott's wife, but as Zelda Fitzgerald, author. I poured my life into Save Me the Waltz, my own story, written from the edge of a hospital bed, every sentence a lifeline against the silence Scott and the world had pressed around me. But when the book appeared in 1932, the applause was thin, the reviews colder than any clinic corridor. Critics called it hysterical, confused, as if a woman's pain could only be understood in translation. They credited Scott for the Southern scenes, as if my own childhood was just another of his inventions. I watched my name shrink beneath his shadow, my words dismissed as a fever dream, a wife's fancy, nothing more. Scott read my novel as if it were an act of betrayal. He wrote to me in a fury, accusing me of stealing his material, of airing our wounds for strangers to gawk at. He said I had ruined Tender as the Night before he could finish it, that I had emptied our marriage onto the page and left him with scraps. In his letters, he demanded revisions, whole chapters gutted, scenes redrawn to protect his reputation, his authorship. I was told to excise the parts that felt too much like us, too much like me. He met with my editor at Scribner's, insisting on changes, on control. The power was his, the contracts, the critics, the final say. I tried to fight, but each argument left me smaller, more exhausted. By 1933, I was revising my own life under his supervision, erasing passages that belonged to me alone. The New York Times ran a headline that called Save Me the Waltz a curiosity, while Tender as the Night was hailed as genius, though it echoed with my letters, my breakdowns, my stolen voice. I became a footnote in my own story. Even now, I can still feel the sting of those revisions, the humiliation of watching my truth rewritten until it belonged to someone else. That was the cost of loving a writer who needed every word for himself. I was the source, never the author. Even now, when I walk the halls of memory, echoes of the Ritz bar, the ballet studio, the endless hospital corridors, I see how easily brilliance devours its muse. Today, women still lose their voices behind a famous man's pen or shadow. My story is not just a love letter, but a warning. You must claim your art, your madness, your name. Otherwise, history will write you as someone else's footnote Tell me, whose story are you living?